All right, here we are. We're looking at a chapter 4.5, a phase shift with a sine function. Okay, so here we have the function y is equal to 2 sine 2x minus pi. So in this section now, we have, in the parentheses, we have a phase shift. Okay, we have to learn how to deal with that. So let's do the easy stuff first. We know how to find the amplitude. That's 2, right? It comes from there. Our period is 2 pi over b. Well, in this case, our b value is also 2. So 2 pi over 2 reduces to pi as our period. All right. Now, it comes down to our phase shift. How do we find this phase shift? Well, what we do is we set that bx minus c equal to 0 and then solve for x. So we set 2x minus pi equal to 0. So here we go. 2x minus pi equal to 0. And that will give us 2x is equal to pi. And so our first phase shift is pi over 2. Now, if you recall in class, we've been going over this 5-step method or 5-key point method. And we know that the sine function goes from 0, max, 0, min, 0. Right? So what we need to do is fill in these boxes here with the values. Now, this first value, this first 0, will always occur at your phase shift. Okay? So whatever that phase shift is where you're going to have that first 0. So that PS stands for the phase shift. So I'm going to go ahead and plug that in now as pi over 2. Okay, so pi over 2. Now, to find the last 0, we take the phase shift and we add the period. All right, so if we take pi over 2 plus our period, which was, come on over here, which was pi, and if I turn pi into terms of 2, that's really 2 pi over 2, which is 3 pi over 2. So our last 0 will occur at 3 pi over 2. Now what we have to do is we have to take half, of the sum, or the average of these two values. So here, this is going to be 1/2 the phase shift plus, right, this initial phase shift plus the phase shift in the period, or 0, 1 and 0, 2. So phase shift slash period, right? That's how we find that. So let's do that. We take 1/2 of pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2. And so this ends up being pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2 is 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. 2 pi divided by or multiplied by 1/2 is just pi. So we know that now that we're here in the middle as pi. Now, again, we're going to take half the distance between pi over 2 and pi. Well, a good way to do this is look at your unit circle. What's halfway between pi over 2 and pi? Well, we should get pi over 4, right? But let's do it mathematically and make sure. Again, we can take 1/2 of pi over 2 plus 2 pi over 2. And so that gives us 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 times 1/2 is 3 pi over 4. Yes, 3 pi over 4, excuse me. 3 pi over 4 There's always something, right? Okay, so 3 pi over 4, and that makes sense that because that's in quadrant 2. Now we want to find the last key point here of this min, which is where we take 1/2 of pi, which is 2 pi over 2, plus, plus 3 pi over 2, which is 5 pi over 2, and when we multiply it by 1/2, we get 5 pi over 4, so our minimum is now at 5 pi over 4. Okay, we are ready to graph this thing. We have enough information for us to graph it. We have our 5 key points. And now what we can do is put this on a graph. So I'm going to face this way here. Here's our graph. And we had an amplitude of 2, if you recall, an amplitude of 2. So I'm going to go up 1, 2, and create my lines here. That's kind of my maximum and minimum borders. And then we went down to, and there's our minimum line. And now we shifted everything over. Remember, our first 0 is not at 0, it's at pi over 2. So I'm going to put that here at pi over 2. Then I have a 3 pi over 4. And then I have a pi, and then a 5 pi over 4. And lastly, we have 3 pi over 2. So now when we graph this thing, we'll start with a 0 at pi over 2. There. We have a maximum at 3 pi over 4, so that's going to come up here. We have a 0 again at pi. Okay, and a minimum at 5 pi over 4, so there's our 5 pi over 4. And finally a 0 back at 3 pi over 2. So what we should see is our curve look like this. And there we go. That is our sine curve with the function y equals 2 sine of 2x minus pi. So that's how we do a basic horizontal phase shift. All right, thank you.